Hello, my name is Abdulwahab Kayali, and I'm a researcher at the Arab Barometer Project and a co-founder of the Arab Political Science Network, the APSN. The APSN is a nonprofit scholarly initiative that seeks to support, enhance, and increase scholars' research and teaching outputs in the study of political science and its related fields. In collaboration with Al-Fanar Media, which specializes in reporting on education, research, and culture in the Arab world, the APSN is holding a series of webinars about topics pertaining to higher education in the Middle East and North Africa. The title of today's webinar is Mission Impossible: Higher Education and Policymaking in the Arab World, which we have borrowed from our guest's latest book. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar and my privilege to introduce our guest, Professor John Waterbury. Hardly in need of an introduction, John Waterbury has had an illustrious career in Middle East and North African-related higher education, and specifically political science. John attended Princeton University as an undergraduate before studying Arabic at the American University in Cairo and getting his PhD in political science at Columbia University in New York. He later taught political science at the University of Michigan and Princeton for about 30 years, 20 of which he served at Princeton. During his teaching career, he has held visiting positions at the American University's Field Staff Facility in Rome and the University of Aix-Marseille, Troyes. In 1998, John became the president of the American University of Beirut, AUB, a position he would hold until 2008. After that, John served as advisor to the government of Abu Dhabi on higher education, as well as professor of politics at NYU Abu Dhabi until about 2015. He currently resides in Princeton, New Jersey. As the PhD advisee of his PhD advisee, or his academic grandson, it is my honor to welcome him with us today. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much.
So before we begin, I'll just say a note on format. I will pose a few questions to kickstart the discussion, after which I will open up the field. 2 questions from the audience. I will gather a few, and then I'll pose another round of questions and conclude with another round from the audience. So that way we make it a little more interactive and we invite the audience's input over the Q&A or box in the Zoom dialogue options. So, John, your book, published by American University of Cairo Press in 2020, is actually titled Missions Impossible in the plural, indicating more than just one mission. I will start with sharing my favorite quote from chapter 1, in which you outline some of the goals and constraints on public policy. Quote, "The ultimate constraint, the mother of red lines, is regime survival. In that context, I have long ago ceased to heed Cassandra-like warnings that the status quo is not viable. To the contrary, the status quo and business as usual are viable, albeit suboptimal. Failing to understand why they are viable and who their beneficiaries are will consign any advice preferred to incumbents to the back of a dusty drawer." With that, we'll start with asking, who did you write this book for, and what is the intended audience? Who do you want to read it?
Well, people like yourself. I am focused mainly on those who work in academia and probably, like myself, haven't reflected all that much on the institutions in which we work. It was only when I took on a leadership role that I began to think seriously about how universities function, and also to policymakers, and particularly policymakers in the Arab world, who are going to affect educational policy going forward. One of the assumptions of the book is that higher education in the Arab world is in a kind of long developing crisis, and it's going to require explicit policy measures to deal with the crisis. So I hope I've been able to frame some of the choices some of the challenges that policymakers are going to face going forward. I doubt if any are going to be big surprises for those who are involved in higher education. But I do try to give a pretty big picture that goes across the entire Arab region and also includes Turkey and Iran.
Okay, so you start and you finish your book by saying you are trying to promote supportive rather than disruptive innovation. Implicit is the belief that Arab political regimes are adaptable, which I imagine you realize is a somewhat contested notion. You also say that you have come to the surprising conclusion that the state of higher education in the MENA is not as bad as it is often portrayed. So can you elaborate on that, and why was this conclusion surprising?
Yeah, the literature I had read leading up to writing the book often emphasized the degree of crisis in higher education. And I pretty much bought into that. And it was only after I had done considerable research that I realized that in many ways, in terms of many of the goals that policymakers had set for higher education, the Arab world hadn't done too badly over the last 40 or 50 years. It had achieved several of its major objectives. So I realized I had to back away a little bit from the notion of a dramatic crisis. I'm not wondering, I'm going to suggest I read something that I saw very recently, which gives you a flavor of how others view the situation. Now, this is written by Safwan al-Masri, who is now back at Columbia University, but Palestinian Jordanian, who wrote the following. Indeed, elsewhere in the Arab world, education systems have evolved, or rather devolved, through decades of deliberate attempts to suppress the Arab mind, resulting in generations of poorly educated, narrow-minded, intolerant individuals, ill-equipped for participation in a globalized world. When education is used primarily as a tool to solidify nationalist loyalty and political legitimacy where there was none, it is unsurprising that hyper-nationalist propaganda, exclusionary rhetoric, and dogmatic religious discourse are now the defining features of contemporary Arab education systems. That was a not untypical blast, and that you can go back 15, 20 or more years and find similar summaries and similar analyses. And I guess I came to the conclusion that they're somewhat misplaced, that a lot has been achieved, and we often overlook it because some of the negative aspects capture our attention at the expense of the positive.
So if you can expand on that a little bit and tell us what do you think the system got right, and how do we avoid the trap of falling into Arab exceptionalism, in the sense that everything that we're doing in the Arab world is wrong?
Yeah.
It's the other kind of exceptionalism in which we see ourselves as not distinguished, but rather on the other side. So if you can tell us what's happening, like what's going well for us and what we can build on.
Right. Well, I don't dismiss the notion of Arab exceptionalism in political terms. Like yourself, I've seen so many quantitative studies that show certain features of the Arab world that do define a kind of exceptionalism. The problem is not so much the conclusion people come to, it's in trying to explain why. And the explanations are often contradictory or inconsistent, and I won't go into them, even though it's kind of tempting to do so. So what I would argue in terms of higher education is that there is a kind of exceptionalism that I try to analyze in looking at the employment prospects of young Arab graduates. And we know, and I know the Arab barometer is documented in many ways, the extraordinarily high rates of youth unemployment and educated youth unemployment in the Arab world. They are unlike any other region in the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, East Asia. So there is something that demands an explanation there, and I try to get into that crisis of ill-prepared students for the existing job markets, and also, equally important, an ill-prepared private sector for the kinds of graduates universities are producing. I think there's a structural problem, and let me give you an example of why I think it's structural. 2008, we had a global financial crisis. It hit the European countries of the Southern Mediterranean very hard, particularly Greece, but also Italy, Spain, Portugal, Cyprus. And we saw youth unemployment skyrocket in all of those countries, up to levels that approximated Arab levels of youth unemployment. But with time, it turned out that for the Southern European countries, this was a cyclical problem, not a structural problem. And unemployment rates began to go down, not to where most leaders would like to see them, but significantly lower than what we find in the Arab world. Meanwhile, the Arab world is still stuck at its kind of 25% educated youth unemployment rates, regardless of country. I noticed, for instance, that even though Tunisia is touted as the one country to have succeeded in the Arab Spring, it hasn't made any difference to youth unemployment in the Tunisian economy. The economy functions largely as it did prior to 2011. Youth unemployment is still very high, and it's facing this same structural problem. So I think trying to find out the reasons for this structural dilemma in the Arab world gets at the issue of exceptionalism.
Okay, so you outline, in the book, you outline the trilemma of higher education, which is quantity, quality, and cost. And you argue that only two of the three can be achieved, and that Arab universities have sacrificed quality. Is this due to economic or political reasons? I.e., is it because Arab universities have struggled to keep up with economic transformations and developing job markets, or is it because the public policy choices are stuck in the political bargain of producing bureaucrats?
Well, I see it, I guess, largely in economic terms, and in terms of the costs of the famous social contract or social contracts that were set up in most Arab countries following independence. There was a certain sameness to them, even though in some ways, some countries were aligned with the West and some countries aligned with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In terms of the social contract, there wasn't necessarily all that much difference. And one of the commitments was to education in general as a force to liberate the citizens of these newly independent countries, and higher education in particular to underscore the independence and economic autonomy of these new nations. That commitment, I think, was laudable, and I certainly don't feel uncomfortable with it at all, but it had a very high economic cost, as did the social contract in general. And as we have seen in so many other analyses, by the 1970s, funding these social contracts became extraordinarily difficult. And specifically in higher education and education in general, we began to see a cutback in a lot of spending ratios, spending per capita, spending as a percentage of GDP, et cetera, and opening the doors to the private sector, which I saw as an act of desperation on the part of many Middle Eastern leaders, because they could no longer find the resources to continue to fund education at the levels they wanted. So they hoped the private sector could step in with the implicit concession that the private sector was going to charge for its services.
Okay. So you offer you offer a remedy for the trilemma, as you propose turning the university into an entity with three goals only: graduating 85% of the students, 80% of whom would find employment, and all of whom would pay off their costs in 10 years. So, in essence, you're proposing that the Arab University double down on teaching and shun research and other goals, changing the value proposition of the university as a whole. This seems to be the exact opposite of where higher education in the rest of the world is going. I mean, we see that in the US, at least for large public research universities, research is of paramount importance, probably like more important than teaching. So can you elaborate on the logic behind changing the value proposition of the university as a whole?
Well, first, let me say that proposal or suggestion was meant to be provocative. I don't necessarily believe in it myself. It'd be run contrary to everything I've done in my own career, and certainly what I was doing at AUB. But I wanted to emphasize that part of the title of the book, The Mission's Impossible, to suggest that the university has too many official missions, and they're often contradictory, and they all cost a lot of money. And I don't see how university leadership anywhere in the Arab world can fulfill all those missions. The trilemma that you've already mentioned is a core part of the contradictions. You want quantity, you want quality, and you want to be able to deliver it at a reasonable cost. And that so far has eluded the Arab world, except in the oil-rich countries, where we could say the costs have been unreasonable. They spend a great deal of money on education and higher education. So we've got the trying to remember where I was going with this. We've got the trilemma, the conflicting missions, and I suggested that you might want to reduce to a very simple group the criteria by which performance of higher education is judged. As I say, it was meant to be provocative. It flies in the face of a lot that I hold dear, but we're facing some major challenges now in the Arab world, and this might be one way to deal with them. At least it should be put on the table.
No, I think it is provocative, and I think I want to do it justice. I mean, you don't say it just fleetingly. You do actually provide concrete recommendations about how to achieve some of this in the conclusion. And I want to encourage our attendees to read the book to give it justice. I mean, it is a provocative proposition, but not entirely unreasonable given the state of the Arab public university and also the state of higher education throughout the world. So I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. Aida Abdulrahim asks, since this year marks a decade for the anniversary of the Arab Spring, how has higher education helped to escalate the Arab revolts? And how has the Arab Spring helped change the higher education, if change actually happened?
Sorry, my phone, of course, went off right in the middle of that question. Could you repeat the last part of that?
Yeah, so Aida is asking basically, what was the impact of higher education on the Arab revolts, and did the Arab revolts help change higher education, if there was any change?
Yeah, I think it comes down, the question of change is a very good one, and I think it comes down to individual cases. There is a lot going on, and I'm having trouble keeping up with it all. There's been a lot going on in Egypt, for instance, where there's been a major reduction in civil service hiring, so that crucial link in the social contract of university graduates moving into public employment is now pretty much ruptured. Al-Fanar recently ran an article on new governance arrangements for Saudi Arabian universities. Some 29 public universities are now going to have effective autonomy. And the explanation given is that they want to free these universities to find their own economic resources. The Tunisians have been, before and after the Arab uprising, experimenting with new formulas in research funding and competitive research grants for research clusters. So I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, and I'm quite encouraged by that. It is, I believe, crisis-driven, and that leadership in the Arab world is acutely aware, especially since 2011, of the linkages between university employment or unemployment and political agitation. There's been a lot of quantitative work on that. I think it's pretty obvious that there are strong links between youth unemployment and political instability, and leadership is beginning to try to address that.
So if I may ask you to expand a little bit, you have some provocative things to say about brain drain and the informal economy and the political expediency of both. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I raised that as an analytic dilemma in my work, and I think in the work of others. And it's something that may be somewhat peculiar to the Arab world or to other autocratic systems. We on the outside, looking at what is going on, try to explain cause and effect. So I see very high rates of brain drain and out-migration of educated youth in the Arab world, or educated people in general. And I say, who benefits? You know, who benefits from that? And I make a logical deduction, which has, I'm afraid, no real empirical basis in fact. The logical deduction is that leadership in these countries is obviously aware of this massive brain drain. I do have evidence in Lebanon, but I'll leave that aside because Lebanon's a little quirky. But leadership is very much aware of the brain drain and the out-migration, very much aware that they've invested in, through their systems of education, in these kids who they then export. And I come to the conclusion that this is deliberate, that they want it this way, that they regard a lot of these educated youth as problems. And that message came home strong in 2011 and recently in Algeria, Sudan, and Iraq in the last year and a half before the pandemic really hit. So it's not a comfortable analysis because I don't have empirical evidence that anybody is thinking in those terms, except I did hear it more than once in Lebanon. And I was lamenting that AUB graduates routinely leave the country and go someplace else. And the person I was talking to said, yeah, that's the way we meant it to be. So, but that's just one anecdotal piece to support that analysis. Informal sector. The informal sector, who knows? Because it's informal, we can't measure its weight in the economy with much precision, but it's often 40% probably of GDP in many Arab countries. It's been there forever. It's a great source of employment for university graduates and others. Why is it tolerated? I think for that very reason, because when the public sector can no longer absorb university graduates, you always have that great sponge, the informal sector, which can take the university graduates and put them to some kind of work and keep them busy. So you tolerate the informal sector, even though if you could incorporate it into the formal sector, you would increase your tax revenues and strengthen public finances. So again, do I have empirical evidence? No, it's a surmise. I look at the result and work my way back to cause. it's a very dangerous démarche, but it's what outsiders are left to do when you don't have insights into the black box that's policymaking in the Arab world.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from the audience about I think the role of primary and secondary education in creating this crisis of mismatch between skills and employment that later is maybe exacerbated in higher education. So I guess I'm gonna collate some of them and pose the question of what is the point of reforming higher education if you still have the same approaches to primary and secondary education that once these students graduate from high school or tawjihi or whatever, then they struggle to keep up with the university requirements, and a lot of them, as you point out in the book, drop out.
Right. A very good question. And one of the reforms I suggest that is doable and would not be politically threatening is to try to emphasize the organic links between secondary education and the university. I'm sure if we worked our way back, we would then say you have to look at the organic links between primary education and secondary, so that the whole system of education, K through 12 to university, becomes an organic unit, policy unit, pedagogic unit, maybe even a civil service unit or employment unit. But yeah, this is absolutely crucial. I don't think there was any place, including in the Emirates, which are quite privileged in most ways, that didn't face this problem of the transition from secondary education to university education and all the remedial work that either needs to be done or isn't being done in order to assure the success of the kids coming out of high school. And you're right, a second reform very much related, organically related to that, is dealing with the very high dropout rates that Arab countries experience, which are a financial disaster and a kind of social disaster, because you invest and then lose your investment when the kids drop out and fail to complete their degrees. Here again, I should emphasize that the Arab world on almost any dimension does not look particularly unique or exceptional, and dropout rates is a very notable example of this. There are high dropout rates in the Arab world, but there are very high dropout rates in the United States. And I think the champion that I found across the world for dropout rates is Argentina. So the Arab world is just sort of in the pack in terms of dropout rates. But this is a kind of scourge, because you waste a huge amount of public resources to come up with a kind of net zero result on your investment.
Okay, another theme that's appearing from the audience's questions is what models can the Arab world look to in terms of higher education? A lot of questions are coming about the adaptability of like Western liberal education models, questions about importing the US-based universities into the Gulf countries. There are some questions about, do we look to China in order to emulate some of what they're doing in higher education? So what are your thoughts on which regions or countries in the world can serve as models for the Arab world to follow in terms of educational development?
That's a wonderful question, and one of the issues that I probably should have developed more in the book, and regret that I didn't, goes somewhat like this. Most Arab countries have what is usually described as a command and control system of higher education. And in public education, I'm going to leave aside the private sector for the moment. And maybe Egypt, because it pioneered in so many ways after 1952, became the paradigm of this. So that today we have something like 29 public universities or 30 public universities in Egypt, they're regional, they have the same basic promotion structures, salary structures, fee structures, regardless of locale. They have, with some exceptions, similar curriculum. It's kind of a one-size-fits-all system. And it achieved a great deal. That was sort of something that it took me a while to understand. It educated a lot of people, not very well, but adequately. And it did it without a lot of distinction or socioeconomic prejudices built in. And so what I want to answer part of the question, why not take the system itself? When I say the system, all of the public institutions of higher learning, the Supreme Councils of Education, and turn them into a quasi-autonomous unit responsible for education at all levels. Singapore might be the closest example that I know of in this respect. I look at a great distance at China. China is trying to combine a lot of things, and maybe I'll come back to that in a minute. Maybe the California system in its heyday back in the 1960s and 1970s, the Clark Kerr model with the great flagship universities like Berkeley and UCLA, then the Cal State system that catered to the broad base of the population in California, and then the community colleges that focus much more on what we might call vocational education. The system was very strong for a while until the Californian population decided they didn't want to fund it. And it's been pretty much starved for resources ever since. But there are models there. But the thing is, the command and control systems might be salvageable, and they are systems with which the Arab world is very familiar now. They wouldn't have to invent something. It would be to empower the existing systems. Now, that may seem a little scary to political leadership because there'd be a lot of resources involved, and to give this whole sector a certain degree of autonomy to manage its own affairs, develop its own internal criteria for performance evaluation might seem very dangerous to political leadership, but it is a possible avenue going forward.
Okay, great. I think there are a number of questions about the role of the private sector and if private education can be a way out of a part of the solution, but also, what is the role of the private sector in supporting educational reform? You talk a lot about the private sector in the book as being, driven by quick gains, crony capitalism, not really interested in becoming part of the education cycle. So, what is the appropriate role that you see that the private sector can play in the development of Arab higher education?
Yeah, that's a moving target, and a lot changed just in the course of my writing the book. There was a study by Adnan Al-Amin and Mrs. Binduri at IIE back in around 2011, which showed that in the Arab world, 90% of all students in higher education were in public sector institutions, and only 10% were enrolled in private institutions. If you looked at institutions, the percentages would be different, but this was, where is the bulk of the students? The public sector. And that changed as I was doing my research. Some places had major shifts, Jordan, for instance, Egypt, Morocco began to take steps towards welcoming private education, Syria, and in some ways the leader of the pack was Iran with Azad University, which when I was last looked had something between 1.5 and 2 million students, so that something like 50% of all Iranian higher education students are technically in the private sector. That percentage of 50% is roughly what we have in Latin America, if we look outside the region. Curiously, the United States is much more public sector oriented than either Iran or Latin America, where about 80% of our higher education students are in public institutions of one kind or another, even though we talk on and on about the private sector. So, but I think the trends are very clear. The private sector is growing just about everywhere in the Arab world, and is likely to claim a larger and larger percentage of the total enrollments in higher education. I think the issues are, for me, does the private sector, which has a kind of inherent autonomy built into its various universities, pose a threat to the public sector model? Are public sector leaders going to be clamoring to get the same advantages that private sector leadership has, which is essentially autonomy, budget autonomy, and policy autonomy to determine whom they admit, how they promote their own staff, what their benefits packages are, all of the components that go into university expenses. The private institutions have considerable autonomy in determining those parameters. Public institutions do not. And this may be the kind of Trojan horse. The private sector may be the kind of Trojan horse that brings about greater autonomy for public institutions if that's going to occur in the future.
Great. I just want to point out that as of now, we have 23 open questions on the Q&A, and we have less than 23 minutes left. So I think it will be difficult to address all the questions. We welcome this level of engagement and this level of interaction, honestly, from the audience. And there are some great questions. Address your question. Please don't take it personally. We're not trying to ignore you, and we're not trying to shun your interaction. So one of the questions and one of the themes that we've talked about before is we've had a great natural experiment in 2020, which is COVID. I mean, COVID has disrupted education in ways that could not have been foreseen before. Do you think it's going to accelerate the trends that you're already seeing in terms of like moving towards digitization and virtual classrooms and that kind of thing, or are we going to go back to, as you call it, BAU, business as usual, after COVID?
I think the simple answer to that is I don't know. And had anyone suggested to me that COVID was coming down the tracks when I was writing, I would have suspended this project until I could see better what the ultimate impact is going to be. I advocated in the book, particularly from a financial point of view, that distance learning and, basically distance learning in various ways, blended learning, could help to reduce costs so that one part of the trilemma is addressed to a certain extent, and that in the command and control systems that we know in the Arab world, distance learning and blended learning could be worked out on a systems-wide basis, not just in individual institutions, but for the entire system. And this would be an area, if you did have an autonomous higher education system, that the people in charge of it could work out common policies and reduce overall costs for all of the functioning units within it. So I can't imagine that this won't be a big boost for distance learning. It's been, I think, a threatening proposition for many Arab countries, but now they may not have much choice. Threatening in the sense that it may debase or be seen to debase degree programs that have national characteristics. I know the Arab Open University has struggled a bit over the years to get acceptance to have its degrees recognized in Arab countries. But if you're working within the systems of education themselves, then the aspects of accreditation become more simple. So yeah, I think this is again a train that's coming down the tracks, like the private sector moving in a big way. I think we're going to see these new techniques in teaching proliferate. Will there be a return to something regarding normalcy that is more face-to-face contact? I think this is an open question. One of the questions in the book that I constantly ask myself is there enough magic of place, as I call it, to justify the bricks and mortar university going out 2 or 3 decades? Or is a place like the American University of Beirut or Cairo University or Mohammed Sank in Rabat essentially dinosaurs? Big physical infrastructures that are very costly to operate and may not be essential to the educational task. I say may not be essential because I don't know. I am a product of the bricks and mortar university, and I've spent my life in them, and I'm very wedded to them. So I raise the question again with great hesitancy, but they're costly. They cost a great deal to operate. You look at a place at a university like Lebanese University with 46 branch campuses, and think of the maintenance costs and operating costs of those 46 branches, personnel costs, and you have to say, is this really necessary? Maybe this all could be done virtually rather than in face-to-face. There are those who argue that there's a kind of magic that goes on inside the physical university that I try to detail in the book, and I won't go over it here, which is irreplaceable. You can't substitute online learning for face-to-face learning, a lot of which takes place outside the classroom. Takes place just in your interactions with your fellow students, with the faculty with one another. There's that kind of research magic that proximity may bring about. I don't know. It's a little touchy-feely for me, but again, I'm a product of it, so I have a natural bias in favor of it. But I think it's going to have to answer a lot of questions if it's to survive.
So I mean, this is a good way to go back to the theme of what is the role of the university. I mean, Amani Jamal asks some questions about the mismatch between employment opportunities and the skills that students learn in universities. And I pose this question to you in a different way. Is it the job of the university? Is it accreditation and to get these students jobs after they complete their education, or is it actually to produce citizens? I mean, I think you're more inclined probably to say it's a bit of both, but your propositions are okay. We should maybe rethink this relationship, and maybe it should be the job of universities to just produce accredited individuals who can land jobs. So can you speak to the mismatch between like university training and employment, and whether or not this is solely an Arab world problem, or is it a more global one?
Oh, it's a more global one for sure. And the job market, however we define it, is changing so rapidly given the technical advances in artificial intelligence and all of those developments that are going on, that it's very hard to keep pace. And I understand the logic of your question. Can the university, if it has a brain, anticipate what needs to be done, particularly when you've got at least a 4-year horizon for most students before they enter the job market? Can you see what's happening? Can you see what's going to come down the tracks? And it may be too much to ask. I know that in Singapore, they feel like this is part of their mission in higher education, to anticipate changes in the job market and be ready for them almost before they happen. And I'm not familiar enough with Singapore to answer the question, have they succeeded? But they've certainly done pretty well. So yeah, it's a very valid question. I want to go back to a point I made earlier, though, and that's the private sector itself, because this is going to be where employment opportunities open up, not the public sector. We see the public sector in a number of Arab countries is actually shrinking. Public employment is being cut back. Egypt and Algeria are examples. So it's the private sector, but the private sector is, how shall I say, not well structured for the products of university education. So it's not necessarily the fault of the universities. They have a private sector which has peculiar characteristics. Because it was regarded somewhat as the enemy for many, many, many years in the Arab world, it has played it safe in terms of its investments, and it's kept a very short time horizon because it never knows when the axe may fall. So it's into speculative real estate development and speculative investment. You can think of Lebanon with its electric generators to back up the public sector system, oil imports, rent seeking, all of that sort of thing. We've got a whole library full of literature on rent seeking in the Arab world, crony capitalism, and most important, an absence in the high-tech sectors, even in areas that are vital to the Arab world, like pharmaceuticals. The Arab private sector is not at the cutting edge of development and research in any of these areas. So there's a private sector mismatch, which is as important as the university mismatch. They're completely out of a line now, and that's going to be the major challenge going forward, I believe, is to get some kind of alignment. But I think, to get back to your earlier question, the universities have to be much more closely engaged with the private sector than they are now, to at least have some sense of where things may be headed, and also to help the private sector reconfigure itself so that it's able to benefit from the products of higher education.
Great. So I just want to note that we may run a few minutes overboard in order to try to address all the questions. So if the audience can hang in with us and see, I mean, this has been already a fascinating discussion. I wanted to ask you about the Arab Political Science Network, because I have to, and I had a question about this. So you identify the weak linkages that the international professional associations have with the MENA region. We established the Arab Political Science Network to better connect the Arab academic community with its international research counterpart. Nathan Brown asks or states that the APSN is based in part on an effort to build a network of social scientists in a region that has not historically been all that friendly to the social science disciplines. I was going to ask about any words of advice you may have for us, basically common pitfalls to avoid falling into. Nathan asks if the trends you see suggest that the APSN is a promising project.
Oh yeah, I support any kind of networking, but I also know how difficult it is. I think yesterday we had a discussion about this, and I pointed out that when I started doing research in the Arab world in the 1960s, things were much easier then than they are now in terms of just about every aspect you could imagine. I find it hard to imagine how you conduct meaningful social science research of the kind I did, field research, interviewing, poking my nose in just about any place I wanted to or could. today it just seems almost impossible. So you have to find strategies that exploit existing bodies of data and knowledge and are not so threatening, but still give you some insights on how the system functions. And I just would mention one that struck me at the time as being particularly ingenious. It was trying to get at crony capitalism in Egypt. And I'm sure some of you have seen this article that Ishaq Diwan wrote with some others. And what they did is they looked at a point in time when Hosni Mubarak had to go abroad for medical treatment, and there was great speculation that he might be dying. And so they looked at all of the companies traded on the Cairo Stock Exchange that were reputedly cronies of Hosni Mubarak, on the assumption that if the boss were in danger of losing his life, those companies would perform poorly on the stock market. And that's exactly what they found. And all you had to do was have the indicators from stock performance and valuation in order to carry that out. When I was starting out, I didn't have to look at sort of indirect methods like that. Now I think it becomes absolutely critical. In any case, the networks, I think, always serve an important function. And they are the links of people who work in considerable isolation and danger to some broader community that can give them some guidance and some help and some hand-holding when they need it. Doesn't solve the problems, but it may mitigate against some of the dangers that social science researchers are facing now in the Arab world.
To build on or elaborate on your own experience, it's been more than 50 years since the publication of Commander of the Faithful, your first book on segmented politics in Morocco, which has been a foundational book in the study of Moroccan politics. How do you think that the main argument has fared over time? And if you can rewrite the book today knowing what you know, how different of a book would it be?
Oh, I think it'd be quite different. Some of it holds up. And I realized many years after I wrote it that I had inadvertently walked into a field which is now called prospect theory in economics, and essentially how people in difficult situations assess risk. And I was struck as a young scholar by the risk aversion of Moroccans. And I looked at one particular event. I don't want to go on too long about this, but I looked at one particular event, which was the split in the Istiqlal Party in 1959. This was the major party that brought about Moroccan independence and was a broad nationalist coalition from everything from Islamic fundamentalists to secular Marxists, all under the same roof. And it split apart in 1959 with considerable instigation from the palace. And what struck me was that the leadership challenge in the party really demanded what I call mutually exclusive choice. You could have me, let's say Mehdi Ben Barka, who was the leader of the radical fringe, or you can have me, Alal al-Fassi, which is the more conservative fringe, but you can't have both because we do not accept each other. And what happened was that most Moroccans presented with that choice simply dropped out. Their political careers atrophied and they stayed out of the arena. Presented with that kind of choice and that kind of risk, they showed massive risk aversion, and it played right into the hands of the palace. It's as if King Hassan was reading prospect theory before it had even been developed. But this served the larger purpose of the monarchy beautifully. And 1959 wasn't the only example of this. So I think there was some validity in what I was talking about. But when we think about the United States right now, and we see that 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, and 81 million voted for Joe Biden, nobody's dropping out. We're presented with mutually exclusive choices, and the great bulk of American people committed themselves to something. So it doesn't always work. And I've looked at other situations since then of mutually exclusive choice in the Arab world, and often found very different behavior than I found in Morocco.
Excellent. In the remaining time, we have a few questions on quality and quality assurance and measuring quality of educational outputs. You talk about this in the book, but can you mention whether or not you're satisfied with the existing metrics of measuring quality of educational outputs, and what, if any, recommendations you have to improve on those?
Oh, yeah, that I could go on for a long time. We introduced quality assurance and key performance indicators at AUB when I was president, and I at least in the abstract, believe in them, but boy, are they disruptive. I think I mentioned in the book that Lebanese University, the only public university in Lebanon, a big behemoth with about 70,000 students, at last reckoning had never signed on to the National Quality Assurance Initiative in Lebanon. Only private universities had. And one of the people in charge of Lebanese University said to me the basic reason was that the leadership of Lebanese University did not believe it had the authority to implement the key performance indicators that the quality assurance framework suggested should be implemented. They didn't have budgetary control, they didn't have policy control, they didn't have political control. And so why go through this humiliating exercise where you know you're going to fail? I think a lot of Arab universities would probably say the same thing. I did see when I was in Egypt some years ago, the entire quality assurance framework at Cairo University, which was very impressive. It hit all the right buttons and all the check boxes were there. But I don't think, having talked to some of the people responsible for it, that it was actually implemented. Again, because university leadership really couldn't be responsible for those KPIs. There was just too many levers that were beyond their reach or beyond their control. So even though they signed on, it was more theatrical than actual. I think in general, it's an important undertaking. I do suggest that, again, this is looking at results and arguing backwards to causes, that the international donor community, the World Bank and others, UNESCO, ESCWA, may see quality assurance as a way of innocuously triggering more far-reaching reform in higher education without scaring the hell out of political leadership. It's possible, but I think there may be that kind of calculus going on, that if we can get institutions to take these KPIs seriously, other much more far-reaching reforms may follow.
Okay, the last question I want to take from the field is one about financing and financing education. We have a question about the crisis of public financing in higher education. Do you think it's a problem of bad governance or just simply the lack of resources? And to what extent is the Arab world exceptional in its financing problems for higher education?
Yeah, it's a very mixed picture in terms of the sheer number of graduates and probably in terms of quality. Arab higher education is underfunded, but if one looks comparatively at expenditures on higher education as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of total government outlays, the Arab world is above average. I think it's ahead of sub-Saharan Africa, but it's well ahead of sub-Saharan Africa, but other regions as well. So there's a lot of money going into higher education. But in terms of, this is back to the trilemma, in terms of the numbers that are being educated, it's underperforming and it's underspending. So you see countries that are trying to tie themselves to the mast, like Egypt, put it in its constitution that a certain percentage of national resources had to be spent on education, and a certain percentage of resources had to be spent on research and development on an annual basis. My impression is that Egypt hasn't lived up to its constitutional commitments, but it's come close, and it's probably a good thing to make a public commitment like that, so that you can at least be shamed if you fail to meet it, or you fail badly to meet it. But as I say repeatedly in the book, it's not purely the absolute amount of resources going in. The Arab world performs pretty well. It's that investment is not having the returns it should have. And that gets back to job placement, job creation, and links of the universities to the economy.
Great. So we still have 22 open questions in the Q&A forum. I don't think we're going to be able to get through to them all. I think a lot of them have answers in the book, and so I would encourage our audience members to read the book, access the book, engage with the book, and I'm sure Professor Waterbury would be happy to answer any follow-up questions you would have later. I do want to end on a personal note, because we don't get to spend time with professors who've had the experiences that you have had in terms of leadership and research in the Middle East for as long as you have. So you've done research all across the Arab world, spanning several decades. Tell us a story about you that we can't read in one of your books, one that has been formative in defining your relationship with this region. If we can end on that note, I think it would be immensely valuable for us.
Oh, wow. I've probably forgotten the ones I should recount. One comes to mind, which you probably couldn't read about, although I did do an article in the Chronicle on higher education at the time. But it was when I was president of AUB, the summer of 2006, that you and I were discussing, Abdul-Wahab, just a little while ago. And I was outside the country when Israel and Hezbollah sort of went at it in Lebanon in the summer of 2006. And I came back by way of Amman, Jordan, and got a kind of service taxi from Amman to Beirut. And the guy who was driving it was Palestinian. And I said, "How often do you do this?" He says, "I do this 2 or 3 times a week." And the hostilities were still going on in Lebanon. The Israelis were still bombing, and there were ships off the coast that were shelling targets on the coast. And I said, "Wow, that's pretty brave." And he said, "Oh no, it's much better than what I was doing before. I was driving Amman to Baghdad." And he said, the Amman to Beirut is a piece of cake. But we got into Beirut, we got into Lebanon, came across the border, went down to Beirut. We came across the northern border of Syria and Lebanon, and went down to Beirut. And I was back on campus for the first time in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And a hot August, sultry day, and the sun was going down. And I got back to Marquand House where I lived, and sort of unpacked what little luggage I had with me. And then I went out for a walk around campus. And for any of you who know the AUB campus, the president's residence is right next to something called the Green Oval. And I knew that we had converted our men's dormitories into housing for what we called essential personnel. It was the summer, so the dormitories were not occupied. There were very few students around. And we needed essential personnel like campus security, the people who ran our power plant, people who ran our computers, all the computer infrastructure, hospital personnel that were essential for the ER, et cetera, et cetera. They had moved into these dormitories. And so it was about 6 o'clock, sun's beginning to go down, there's a little bit of cool creeping in. And I got up to the green oval and it was just packed with the families of these AUB employees. They were Christian, they were Druze, they were Sunni, they were Shia, some were veiled, some were in shorts. The kids were all running around playing soccer and throwing balls, and people got their little grills out and were cooking kebabs and shish taouk, and they were all mixing. And I said, great God, this is what this university is about. This was one of the, I just felt so proud. and you wouldn't find that except in something I wrote for the Chronicle on Higher Education. But it was a wonderful moment.
That is a very special moment to end on. Thank you for sharing that with us. Let me take this opportunity to thank the audience that has been with us. The name of the book that we discussed today is Missions Impossible. It is published by American University of Cairo Press in 2020, in which John Waterbury lays out his thinking on many of these issues that we have discussed today, and I'm sure it will have answers for a lot of the questions that we haven't been able to answer. Let me take this opportunity also to inform the audience that if they've enjoyed the proceedings of today, they can find out more information about the Arab Political Science Network on our website, arabpsn.org. We have a couple of webinars planned in the future. We have one on February 4th on researching Arab Americans. And so if you're interested, please follow us on Twitter and Facebook and go on our website, sign up to our mailing list, and that way you can find out more about our activities. John, this has been my personal privilege and pleasure, and I hope I wish you the best for the book, and I hope we can meet in person soon and continue to discuss these issues that we all hold dear to us. So thank you for being with us. It was a great pleasure.
Abdul, my thanks to the Arab Political Science Network and to Al-Fanar Media. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.